That is the formal name, if you will, for the stimulus package that was passed in late March, aimed at shoring up the economy, helping small businesses and individuals. It totaled $2.2 trillion, so an enormous amount of federal relief. And here you can see really a snapshot of how all that $2.2 billion measured out. A significant amount of money for corporations and small businesses, individual relief to help during these times of financial uncertainty, some aid to state and local governments as they are on the front lines in dealing with this pandemic, and of course, additional resources for our public health needs. But here you can see just a snapshot of what that CARES Act entailed. Next slide, please. All in all, the CARES Act was a significant win for the boating industry. Before that was passed by Congress and signed into law by President Trump, our industry was heavily advocating on Capitol Hill with our boating champions to make sure that the needs of recreational boating businesses were taken care of. And as a snapshot of some of the small wins or really big wins that we were able to achieve, it includes the $350 billion in small business loans, a delayed payment for Social Security payroll taxes, modifications for net operating losses, temporary funding for the short-term state compensation programs, and a new lending program that was targeted towards medium-sized employers. Some significant wins that we know the industry will benefit from during this financial uncertainty. Next slide, please. So as you look to navigate this federal aid package and how your businesses can best benefit from it, the real critical question is to ask yourself, how big are you? Are you a business or a manufacturer with either 500 employees or on the boat manufacturing side, less than 1,000 employees? If you can answer yes to that question, on the left side of the screen is a list of available options that were included in this CARES Act package that can benefit your businesses, whether it is economic injury disaster loans, a paycheck protection program, a Social Security tax deferment, some write-offs. That's available to you if you answer yes to being under 500 employees or as a boat manufacturer under 1,000. Now, if you are greater than that and your size exceeds those limits, there is some significant relief still available to you. It might not be things that you're hearing on the news on a daily basis, but many of those tax credits, the net operating loss carryback, and particularly this Federal Reserve 13.3 program is available for medium to larger size businesses. There are a little bit different terms, but loan guarantees are available depending on your actual size. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned a couple times, the Paycheck Protection Program is definitely the most popular option, and of course what many of you have been exploring or maybe have already taken action on. Just as a recap, those employers who have less than 500 employees, or if you are a boat manufacturer with less than 1,000, you are eligible. This program is being distributed through over 2,500 lenders as well as the Small Business Administration. It started in April and is open until June 30th. Now, how much can you qualify? Well, it's 2.5 times your business's average monthly payroll cost. That's the maximum amount of the loan qualification. It is capped at $10 million. This loan is intended to give you finances to cover your payroll costs, whether it's salary, wages, healthcare, rent, utilities, for 8 weeks. Now, during that 8-week period, if you keep your workforce at the same levels and you do not reduce their wages greater than 25%, at the end of the loan term, you can go back to the financial institution showing them those data points, and 100% of the loan will be forgiven. This is really an intended government program to help you keep folks on payroll, particularly when many of your businesses we know are being forced to close due to CDC recommendations and state executive orders. This is an opportunity to get the government to help you pay your employees during that 8-week period. Next slide, please. Beyond the Paycheck Protection Program, and particularly if you are a business that might not qualify for that given size restrictions, There are several other additional business relief efforts that are contained in the stimulus package. It's a modification of net operating loss. There's a payroll tax credit. There's an ability for you to defer your Social Security tax as part of your employer obligations to half at the end of 2021 and the other half at the end of 2022. There's an increase here from 30% up to 50% to write off your business interest expenses, as well as immediate recovery of AMT credits and a write-off of your facility improvement costs. So again, these measures are aimed to help you in long-term financial planning and be able to give a little bit of breathing room during this financial uncertainty. Next slide, please. So what is on the horizon? I know many of you are eager to ask your questions. There has been ongoing discussions about what we're calling a CARES Act 2.0. The payroll protection program in particular has been extremely attractive and popular, and there are serious concerns of it running out of funding or have already run out of funding. And so Congress is in the midst of negotiating additional money for some of those programs. We continue to talk to the administration and work with our key voting champions for tariff relief, understanding that at this time, when you're looking to make sure you have enough money to keep your lights on and keep your employees, now is not the time to be paying additional tariffs on products that you're bringing from overseas. We continue to work closely with the Department of Treasury to get more details on lending programs such as the Main Street lending program that is aimed towards more medium and larger sized businesses to provide loan assistance and relief. And even before the ink was dried on the CARES Act, there have been discussions on Capitol Hill of a possible fourth and even fifth stimulus package. Major projects such as infrastructure, whether it's your typical highway or even your water infrastructure projects, are in negotiations, and we expect this not to be the end of it. Though the CARES Act is kind of hard to imagine what more you could do with $2.2 trillion, but given what this pandemic has done to the U.S. economy and the forced closures that have resulted, we definitely expect more action to be taken by the federal government. And they're not alone. Additional state assistance will be forthcoming. Obviously, the states are facing their own financial issues as a result of this pandemic. But I just heard, for example, states like Florida, they're going to be coming back into session this summer and even into the fall to provide critical relief and budget issues for that state. So we will keep a close eye on additional activity from the federal government as well as actions from the state government in the weeks and months to come. Next slide, please. So given that recap, again, we want to make sure we get to as many of your questions as possible. I will go ahead and kick it off because we got a few questions at the beginning, and then I'll have my colleague, John Michael, start asking some questions as well. This is when I'm going to turn it over, of course, to my colleagues at Forbes Pay Partners so they can give you some of their insight from what they're hearing on Capitol Hill and their own experience with some of these programs. So the first question that I am seeing is, okay, under the Paycheck Protection Program, which expenses are eligible for loan forgiveness compared to which ones are not eligible for that loan forgiveness? Maybe George or Ryan, can you take that one?
Yeah. Hi. Yeah. Under the interim rule, this is Ryan. The focus remains on payroll, and that is the primary expense. About 75% of the forgivable amount has to be your payroll. But beyond that, you are allowed to expense your mortgage interest, rent payments, utilities, healthcare costs of your employees, and I think that is it. Trevor, did I miss anything? But those can only equate. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say there may be an allowance as well for existing debt, for payments on existing debt. But again, that falls into the 25% category, so not much.
Okay, so the bulk of these expenses that are eligible are going to really be your payroll. That's to keep your employees on. There is a little bit of a buffer, as they've said, with 25% for some of your other operating expenses, but the majority needs to be used for your employees' payroll. Okay, another question I had. We have a company that applied for the payroll protection program. They were immediately told they were accepted and approved, but they haven't heard anything. And so there's a concern out there that all of this $350 billion has run out. Any insight to those companies that have gotten approval but maybe haven't seen the money yet?
Yeah, Nicole, and that there's kind of a multi-step process here, and so the important part will be talking with your bank to understand whether your bank has approved you and submitted to SBA, or whether the bank has approved you and the portal closed because the money ran out, and so it has not been submitted to SBA yet. They shut the system down to SBA in advance of getting to the $349 billion, with the idea that anything that had made it into the SBA system would be able to be processed there. But what we're hearing at this point is, yes, there are going to be people that have submitted to their banks that may not have completed all of those hurdles, and so it hasn't made it to SBA yet or been approved by SBA yet. And so part of that is just a conversation with your banker, because there is a possibility that even after we heard they were out of money, the reality was they had announced they were out of money and closed the portal, understanding that they had to finish their process on those bills. I say all that with the understanding that for those of you that have submitted and been told SBA had approved, I do believe that money will show up to you in the next short period of time. But it is possible that they did their math wrong and accepted more SBA accepted more than they actually had funding for, and you may be put in a queue to wait for more funding to arrive, which we expect in the next week to 10 days.
Okay, so if you haven't gotten your money yet, the best option is to talk to your financial institution and get clarity from them whether they've gotten the approval from SBA or not.
Yeah, because I know from talking to some banker friends of mine, for instance, one of the major banks, they believe they have somewhere between 35 and 50 billion in loans that had made it through their process but didn't make it over to the SBA. So there is holding capacity at the banks that are waiting for new SBA money to arrive.
Okay. Another question. So what if I've already furloughed employees? Am I eligible for forgivable loans under the Paycheck Protection Program if I bring them back?
Yes, that I believe the expectation is that you will have those furloughed employees back on the payroll within the 25% rule there by the end of the period, the June 30 period. That's the expectation is you bring employees back to your pre-crisis levels by the end of the June 30 period with that 25% caveat.
Okay. So you've mentioned this a couple of times, and maybe George and Trevor, you can pipe in too. There's a concern, or there's a reality right now that this Paycheck Protection Program has run dry. What do you see in the forecast for the next couple of weeks to Do you think there's an opportunity that more money will come? Will people have to reapply for it, even if they've already applied? What are you seeing in terms of negotiations on Capitol Hill to get more money for the small business program?
Well, I'll just start with this one. Between the three of us and our colleagues at FTP, we've been making the rounds this morning to get a check-in on negotiations, and I wish I could report there's significant progress, but not a lot of news to report today, except that Secretary of the Treasury Mnuchin, who's the lead negotiator for the administration, continues talking with the top Democrat in the Senate, Minority Leader Schumer, and Speaker Pelosi. And we've gotten consistently, certainly since yesterday morning, is that the talks are going well. Unfortunately, not well enough to have produced a deal. A lot of this may seem familiar because this is exactly the sort of brinksmanship and posturing we saw leading up to the passage of the CARES Act, which passed under unanimous consent on both sides of Congress. And so you have to wonder, if you had a product that ended up being acceptable for unanimous consent on both sides, why did it require so much drama and sniping to get it done? That's for another day and a webinar on the state of partisan politics in Washington. But the reality is there is clear consensus that PPP needs more money. That was brought home yesterday morning when SBA and Treasury announced that they'd run out. That bucket was empty. Democrats are just holding out to say, as long as we're going to pass more money to replenish that fund, let's go ahead and plus up some other accounts. And they're specifically wanting more money made available immediately for state and municipal governments. They want additional money available for the food stamp program, and they want more money placed in the pot for hospitals and healthcare needs. So, again, we won't eat up too much time here as to why some are resisting that and why Democrats are dug in so hard. But the dynamics are very much the same as they were last time. The Treasury Secretary is negotiating this out with Democrats. The question is whether Senate Republicans in particular are going to be willing to accept whatever deal Mnuchin strikes with Democrats. And with each passing day, one can argue the Democrats are losing leverage as people confront the reality of not being able to access this PPP program. So we'll see how that goes. Now, Ryan said earlier, 7 to 10 days. A week ago, as we headed into Easter weekend, we thought things looked pretty good. We thought of these things that Democrats were asking for. The president had indicated he was open to them, and Mnuchin had said positive things. But then over the weekend, things for some reason turned south, and then negotiations just have not really progressed this week. But I agree with Ryan. I still think it's reasonable to expect within the next 7 days or so that PPP is going to be cranking out SBA is going to be cranking out these SBA loans again. As to whether anyone needing to start the process again, that's clearly not the case. SBA was very clear that they're not going to process they're not going to clear new loans without having money for them. But it can be characterized as a pause, not as having to restart anything. The last thing I'll just say, for anyone who wonders whether problems that you've had with PPP, there are clearly lots of problems. That legislative language was written very quickly. There are lots of technical corrections needed. You've had a lot of groups like NMA making some very compelling cases about certain kinds of businesses that were left out, that we've determined Congress didn't need to leave out. We see a lot of attention being paid to nonprofit groups that were left behind. For example, C6 organizations, trade organizations like NMA. Those kinds of fixes and adjustments and extensions of dates and deadlines, as of now, the plan is still to move on and deal with those in what is still being called CARES 2. This funding piece of legislation continues to be focused on just the funding. Now, I'll offer this caveat, however. With every day that drags on, there's increasing interest in maybe trying to take care of a few of these mechanical things. So in all likelihood, they will probably just do a deal on funding. PPP will get plussed back up and the loans will start flowing again. But they may actually have enough consensus to say, look, it was silly to leave some of these nonprofit groups out. Let's go ahead and expand them then. I'll stop there.
Okay, great. John Michael, you have a couple other questions that you've seen come through?
I do. First up, does foreign ownership disqualify you from receiving an SBA loan under PPP?
I'm happy to
Trevor,
take that.
Trevor, I'll let you handle that one.
Sorry, the first part of that question got cut off. Could you just repeat that?
Yep. Does foreign ownership disqualify you from receiving a SBA PPP loan? In the context, I guess it's helpful here as we're a U.S. company, but we're owned by a foreign subsidiary.
Yeah, so the way the rule's written, foreign ownership of a company would indicate control of that entity, and that could be a limiting factor in the ability to get a PPP loan. One of the, that lends itself to the bigger question about affiliation and how one entity exerts control over another, and what that does to impact your ability to qualify for that. That's something that is, it's possible to get more clarity on going forward, but the way that the rule is initially written, it would make it problematic for foreign ownership to have control over a company and thereby making it eligible. Now, again, all of the employees, it sounds like, are based in the United States. That lends itself to make a pretty good argument. But the foreign ownership component of that is problematic, yeah.
Yeah, they did soften the terminology during this interim process from no foreign ownership to primarily the payroll is primarily and the work and et cetera is primarily in the United States. However, again, as Trevor says, there still are affiliation issues that you'll have to deal with as far as control.
Okay. Here's hopefully a quick one. Can you apply for the Paycheck Protection Program if you have no employees but have rent?
Sorry, you have no employees, but you have rent. So what I would think is that you're talking about a sole proprietorship. And in a sole proprietorship, yes, there is a process there for you to apply. Your bank will ask for you to make a reasonable assessment of your pay as a sole proprietor. But I do think you will have to be able to show some level of quote unquote paycheck for the sole proprietor to allow for the rent. So because you have to have 75% of the loan be paycheck. So you won't be able to get it strictly to cover your rent. I'll put it that way. The EIDL loan, however, may be a workable solution if, for whatever reason, the PPP doesn't work for you or you're not getting sufficient funding. But sole proprietorships are eligible for the PPP.
Thank you. Is healthcare considered a payroll expense when calculating the 75% payroll amount?
Yes, I believe that healthcare is it is covered within the 100%. Hold on just 1 second. Let me confirm which side it goes in, but I believe it goes within the payroll amount. Trevor, you want to?
Yeah, I have it right here. Compensation, so salary, wages, commission, any paid time off, family, medical, sick leave, as well as health benefits, mortgage interest, rent, and utility are part of those eligible expenses in the 75%.
Right. Yeah, includes your premium, retirement, payment of state and local taxes assessed on compensation of employees as well.
Thanks. Can we dig a little more deeper into the forgivable part of this program? For example, you mentioned something about keeping 75% of your employees will make you eligible for the forgivable loans.
I'm sorry, I don't know that I understood the question.
Yeah, I think there's a little bit of confusion over what you have to do and the certain precautions you must take in order to have your loan be forgiven. We've talked about the number of employees you have to keep and the benefits that covers, but just a little more context on what you should do to make sure this loan will be forgivable at the end.
Well, and I want to caution you that we are giving our advice the best we know it, but frankly, all of us are concerned and confused about the nature of that question. It has been and continues to be the biggest warrior for the financial institutions and for those applying as well. It is our understanding that you cannot have reduced compensation, wages, or employees by more than 25% for it to be forgivable.
And I think it's important to note for folks on, if you do get this program, you need to keep track of how this money ends up being used. The forgiveness is not automatic. You'll have to go back to your financial institution to show what the loan was used for and to prove things like Ryan just said, that you didn't have significant workforce reductions or reductions in wages and salaries. That will then be at the culmination of the loan period for you to show that and ask for forgiveness.
Nicole, George, I think this is probably best for you. Are you sure that recreational boat builders are allowed the 1,000 employee cap for PPP? So I think folks are hearing a lot about the 500 employee cap. The question, and there's a few of them here, of why is the recreational boating industry granted the 1,000 cap?
It's not that we're just super special, though we all know we are. Typically for small business loans, yes, 500 is what you hear, but it also provided other benchmarks for specific industries. That's included. There's a whole SBA chart that we can link to that and provide that for all attendees, but you can look under your industry, and oftentimes your industry might have other either employee caps or even revenue caps that show if you are qualified or not, and boat building is specified as one of them. And for boat building operations, it is 1,000. So, in general, it's 500, but there are industry-specific rules. And for our industry on the manufacturing side, it is increased to 1,000.
And that is a long-standing situation. That play has existed for a long time. Nicole mentioned revenue levels. Our reading of the PPP program is that those revenue restrictions do not come into play for the PPP. So if you didn't have a special employee number, but you had a special revenue number for your industry sector, you would be subject to the 500 employee level. That revenue level wouldn't come into play. And that's our reading of the law at this point.
And I would say for the marine industry, where we saw some revenue caps in previous SBA accommodations are for dealers and for marina operators. So again, you can fall under the 500. The big question is how many employees. You would fall under the 500, and then for your boat builders, it's 1,000.
Thank you. The next question is about the cap on employees with salaries over or wages over 100,000. Are there any restrictions on the distribution of the funds received from the PPP program to your employees? The formula caps individual key employees at 100,000. There's a couple questions about what this $100,000 limit means as far as wages. So a little more context on that, if you guys could provide, that'd be great.
Yeah, our reading of it, and if you look in the interim final rule, they kind of they offer some examples there. Our reading of it is similar to how your payroll taxes for your employees cut off at a certain dollar amount for Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, whichever it is, that you treat all of your employees that make over $100,000 like they make $100,000 annually, and so you can cover their compensation at that level for that. My reading of it, and Trevor, back me up on this, is the amount of your loan is determined by that. As long as you are spending the dollars that you got from that loan on payroll, it does not matter who gets that money or how much of it they get. That 100,000 limit was to set a top line amount that you could receive for the loan. As long as that loan is being used for payroll, it doesn't matter whether employee A that makes $40,000 a year or employee B that makes $150,000 a year, where that money is allocated from. I do strongly encourage you, though, to segregate that payroll, the PPP funding, because as Nicole said, you will be required to show your work at the backside of this. But as long as you are spending it on payroll, it doesn't matter, in our reading, I believe, who that funding goes to.
Yeah, the one caveat I would add to that, Ryan, is that, again, there are restrictions in the amount of forgiveness if you reduce your employees' compensation by more than 25%. So in that respect, paying choosing to pay employees that are making more than $100,000 their full salary at the expense of paying people making under $100,000, up to 75% of that salary will reduce the amount of loan forgiveness, if that makes sense. So, employers need to make sure that they're not reducing compensation to those employees under $100,000 by more than 25%. Otherwise, it will start to cut into the loan forgiveness.
I think that's a really good point. I know we've been asked questions like this before. Just to put a finer point on it, let's say you have two employees, each make $150,000. When you do your average monthly payroll calculation, just count them both as $100,000. And that's going to give you kind of, as Ryan said, your top line. You obviously want to maximize the amount of loan you can receive, but you will just count them as making $100,000 rather than count them as making $150,000. So they can be included. They're just anything above that 100,000 threshold cannot be part of your loan calculation.
Thank you. There are a few questions about. Yep, there are a few questions about the 8-week pay period and when that starts and stops. And a few of them have context of my state has essentially shut us down and will open us up in a month. So do we get to pick when we can use this 8-week pay period for, or is it locked based on a certain set of dates?
Right now, that 8-week pay period starts on initiation of the loan. I expect at some point in the future there will be some tweak to that, but right now that's the way the legislation and the interim final rule reads is the day that the money shows up in your account starts the 8 weeks. I can't confidently tell you that will change, but I suspect that there will be some changes to that to reflect exactly what you're talking about.
And I'll just add to that, this has come up with lots of our clients, and as we talk with people on the Hill, this is one of those ones you see bubbling to the surface, to Ryan's point, that's causing us to have some confidence they're gonna provide some clarity on this, because there's too much ambiguity there. The phrase costs incurred and payments made, well, the problem is with the word and what was intended there in terms of the folks who wrote it. You can interpret that a couple of different ways at least. So that's one of those ones we kind of have to put a pin in it.
How are part-time employees factored into the PPP program?
They are. You are expected to take a yearly average of all full-time, part-time, and seasonal employees to determine your employment level.
There's not a distinction as we read it.
Here's a couple process questions. If we applied for a PPP directly through the Small Business Administration 2 weeks ago, but haven't heard back yet, do we need to reapply through our own bank if they are SBA approved?
I'm not familiar with direct application process for PPP. I wonder if the questioner put in for the emergency disaster loan, the EIDL, and because that was a direct application through the SBA. I'm not aware of an allowance for direct application to the SBA because the SBA will not be lending through PPP. They provide the guarantee and the funding to banks. So I suspect that's the EIDL that you applied for, which was on the SBA website. So the PPP does have to be done through a bank.
And just on EIDL, we're all familiar with all the reporting and your own experiences with difficulties with PPP. The EIDL program has had its own problems. One in particular, that the amounts being approved are much lower than I think would have been expected from Congress when they did that. So EIDL has had its own problems, much of which has to do with lack of bandwidth at SBA. They're used to using that program in the immediate wake of tornadoes and natural disasters for a burst of time, and they're beyond their capacity on that now. So if the person is indeed talking about accessing that EIDL program directly through SBA, I wouldn't be surprised if they haven't heard back. I think they just have to keep trying.
Can PPP money be used to prepay rents?
I don't think there is any specificity in the regulations that I've seen about when the rent is for that you're paying. However, it will still have to fit within that 25% threshold. And as everything, again, that's one of those, you've got to make that decision for yourself. But when reviewing for forgiveness, that may or may not become a problem for you. The regulations don't have any specificity on that I've seen.
I think this is a really important part that obviously, folks are going to want that loan forgiveness. And you just have to keep in mind, whatever size loan you get, 75% of that needs to be used for payroll. That's really the critical part, is that you use the bulk, that 75%, to cover your payroll costs. Now, as we've said, there are allowances for other expenses like rent, but it can't exceed 25%. 75% has to be really directed towards keeping folks on your payroll at about or as close to the wages that they had previously received.
Yeah, and one more question just came in about that to clarify. So 75% for wages, 25% would cover all other costs. Is that correct?
Correct. Correct. All other eligible costs. Let me be clear. All other eligible costs. This package unfortunately did not allow you to cover all of your operational costs. There are explicit set asides that are covered at this point under PPP.
And I would just encourage folks, we have several resources and we'll directly email them to you after this call so you can see exactly what are your eligible expenses, exactly what are your ineligible ones. Those are the guidelines that we have. If they don't fall in those buckets, that's really the guidance we have. It becomes more of a gray area, but we'll make sure that you have those lists following this webinar.
Can I participate in both the PPP and EIBL? It's supposed to be DL.
Yes, you can. However, you will not be eligible for other SBA loans in 2020. But EIDL and PPP can both be participated in. Well, it makes sense for a lot of reasons, but if you've got an EIDL and we're intending to use it to cover eligible expenses under PPP, then you are allowed to, and you absolutely should, transition any EIDL loans that were covering the eligible expenses under PPP over to PPP, because EIDL is a 30-year note at 3.75 that isn't forgivable. And the PPP is a 2-year loan at 1% that, if you follow all the rules, is completely forgivable. So you can move that over. Your banker should be able to help you do that if you have an existing EIDL loan and want to move the eligible parts of your EIDL over to the PPP. Your banker should be able to help you do that.
Looking for clarification on when the 8 weeks start for the PPP funds. If we have been paying our employees for a few weeks during the shutdown before the time the loan is initiated, can we not use the funds for the time period before we had those funds?
We know this is an issue, but according to the terms of the loan, you can only start using those funds once the loan is received on the origination date of the loan itself.
Within the 8 weeks following the receipt of the loan. And this gets back to that, what we touched on earlier with some ambiguity in there in the wording. It's a niggling issue that Congress is going to need to deal with in the follow-up CARES 2 legislation.
And I would just add, folks, if you've gotten a PPP loan or you're having issues, what we are constantly seeking is feedback, right? So what trouble are you facing? Is it that you kept people on payroll, now you got this loan and you can't use them for back pay? Is it issues with foreign ownership or affiliation? We really need that feedback. As much as we can give concrete examples to our voting champions on the Hill, that will help to drive the conversation for future packages. So as you may have seen, we have an email that you can send even additional questions, but we'd like to hear your stories because that helps us to really be able to put some pressure on Congress to make the changes that you're seeing in real life that are needed.
Are dental plans considered health care and thus payroll?
It says medical, So unless my colleagues on the phone think otherwise, I would say yes, that medical is health, dental, and vision.
I would agree.
We applied for a PPP loan for full-time employees only, but can we now reapply for seasonal and temp employees after the SBA loan has been approved in future applications?
The current regulation only allows you to apply one time per entity. That again could change, but as of right now, it only allows for one application per entity.
Changing gears here a bit, is there a minimum number of employees to qualify for the Main Street lending program?
It is intended, I believe it is intended for 500 to 10,000 employees. That's what the legislation outlined for it. We have not seen the interim final rule for it. The comment period for Main Street ended yesterday. We have seen that Treasury has been flexible in ways that we didn't expect exactly from the legislation. So it's hard to say right now. What we can say is the intent was for companies with employees between 500 and 10,000.
And I'll just offer a bit of translation there, because Ryan's referenced this a couple times. When Congress passes something like the CARES Act, the agency or agencies tasked with basically implementing that and carrying it out as law go through a process that goes through a rule-making process. And that produces documents, guidance that come back out to all of us that say, here's how we're interpreting this, and here's how we're moving forward on implementation. So we got that on PPP. Ryan was referencing that earlier. That's what's guiding some of what we're telling you today. I think it's really important to understand the distinction between PPP and this Main Street lending program. With the PPP program, Congress was very prescriptive and to a large degree stayed within the parameters of existing lending programs. So we were talking about the EIDL program. It's actually like this too. It existed at SBA. They just put a huge amount of money into it and expected a lot more money to go out for it. And PPP was falling within a lot of existing small business lending practices. This Main Street program was established a great deal more latitude for the Secretary of the Treasury, and that's much more open to their interpretation. And so we're particularly anxious to see how Treasury interprets that. And as Ryan says, we've already seen some interesting examples of flexibility.
And the Fed, George.
Sorry,
Actually,
and the Fed.
The Federal Reserve. Yeah.
Yep. Anyway, point being, that's a completely different kettle of fish, and we're still waiting to see how they intend to start rolling that out.
What tax credits are you eligible for if you take PPP loan? Are you also able to take advantage of the write-offs if you take the loan?
You are not eligible for the employee retention tax credit if you take the PPP loan. For certain, I am not. I don't think there's explicit prevention of other tax credits at this point. But for the employee retention tax credit, yes, you will not be eligible for it.
I have received the advance of the EIDL loan. How long does it take to process the loan application to see if you're approved for further funds?
I think longer than we all expected is the only answer I can give you right now. They are processing those loans, but it has not, much like the PPP, it has not happened with the expedience that we would expect.
Here's one that I'll handle. Will you be able to provide a recording of this webinar again? We will. It'll be emailed with some other information. There's another general question about outdoor recreation access and what NMMA is doing to help lift restrictions and protect access that is currently available. Nicole, do you want to address that?
Yeah, happy to. So hopefully you've seen on our website, we have a document that is being updated daily with the various restrictions on boating access across all the 50 states. In general, there are only 3 states with all-out bans on boating. 28 states have more unrestricted access, and in 19 states, it's a little bit varied whether you can operate at public ramps or marinas, or it tends to be sometimes a county-by-county ordinance. So what we are doing on behalf of NMMA, one, we are monitoring this every single day and trying to provide you daily updates for your state and what those access restrictions or opportunities look like. The second thing we're doing is we are in constant communication with departments of natural resources, the boating law administrators, and the governor's office, particularly for those states where either there's an all-out ban or some restriction, to try and position the industry for opening back up. For example, in Florida, we have been talking with the governor's office all this week and are also scheduling a call, hopefully for mid next week, to discuss this issue even further with the Fish and Wildlife Commission, with the Boating and Waterways Commission, and with the BLA there. We have industry representatives that are meeting. For example, in Miami-Dade County, there's a task force that was set up to try and reopen boating access in that county. And what we're also doing is, since we're able to take a global perspective, sharing what other states and counties are doing to allow responsible boating access. So whether it's a restriction on the amount of people that can be in the boat, some social distancing parameters that we've seen to be effective at boat ramps to minimize person-to-person contact, prohibitions of rafting up for boats so we don't see those parties and again get into social distancing issues. So monitoring, advocating behind the scenes for changes where appropriate, and also helping to influence governments by providing guidance on best practices for boating to try and keep those waterways as open and as accessible as possible. And lastly, I hope many of you have seen just this week, we sent out a Boating United alert. It's a really easy way on your phone for you to send a letter to the governor in your state, encouraging responsible boating access. The more, of course, they hear from our industry, the better it will be to get us on the other side of this pandemic. And I think there's as we all can tell, a yearning to get outdoors. And so I encourage you, your employees, or if you're a part of a boat club, to use that Boating United alert and encourage your governor to allow responsible boating access. Any other questions, John Michael?
2 more. First one, if you are unable to get the PPP loan, are you able to take the tax credit?
Yes.
The next one here is a little nuanced on affiliation, so I apologize if this is a little too weedy. In reference to the PPP and 100,000 employee cap, is it necessary to roll up all affiliated companies, even when some affiliates do not have the same shareholders, but may have some common corporate directors? And I raise this because I know the affiliation questions on a lot of folks' minds.
Trevor, you want to handle that? I think you spent more time on the affiliation part than I have and understand what's going on around VC and private equity and other things as well.
Yeah, so it's obviously a pretty technical question. Common I guess common board members or directors is not necessarily does not necessarily qualify two separate companies as having an affiliate relationship. There is, I think, a broader question still about how the SBA is defining control. And yes, historically within the SBA, if there's too much board member or director member overlap from one company to the next, they've declared that as an affiliate relationship. But I think that honestly, it's a case by case basis for each company, which I know is not an answer that everyone is gonna love. But with respect to how they're defining that aspect of the affiliate rule, there's still, I think, some clarity that needs to be pulled forth by the SBA on that. I don't know if that answers directly where that question was going. I'm happy to try again if there's something separate that I'm not getting to.
I think that was good, Trevor. I know a lot of you have those questions on affiliation. As you were saying, it's a case-by-case basis of how you are, how you are incorporated. What does that common governance structure look like? What is the control? Those are all going to be determining factors that we can't really give you guidance on, but that's going to be made by your lending institution. I will say I've spoken to some of you, if given the mergers that have happened in the past few years, you can have separate brands, and maybe they're even, very different boat brands. But if there is common ownership and it's just under different names, you would be subject to the affiliation rule and would have to aggregate the amount of employees you have amongst all those brands. So that's where we've seen it most likely happen in the marine industry. Just because you have a different brand name doesn't necessarily mean you can treat those different locations as separate entities. Well, we are right at the 1 o'clock mark. I really want to thank my presenters, George, Ryan, and Trevor for helping out today and being able to provide some guidance and answer some of your questions. I want to thank all of you for joining. As a reminder, this has been recorded, so we will include that recording and send it out to you, as well as the PowerPoint slides. On the last slide is a link to all the resources. So again, I know you had some questions about what are eligible expenses, how to get more guidance on the PPP program. That is all included in our resource guide. And we are going to be keeping a close eye on further actions in Washington, D.C. If you come across issues or you've had some problems applying for any of these loans or using these funds, please let us know. We have an email that has been included. That is the best way to contact us on your COVID issues, and we will be able to that insight is really helpful to be able to go to Capitol Hill and seek changes either in a CARES 2.0 or further stimulus packages. So thanks for joining us today. We really appreciate it, and hope you have a healthy and safe weekend.